This video is about viruses, and viruses are non-living particles that hijack cells. How can we tell if something is alive or not? Well, we have to start by establishing some criteria. Criteria means standards. So there are certain criteria or standards that a thing must meet before being defined as living. And if there's just one of these standards, the way you'd use the word is criterion. So you'd have one criterion, you'd have many criteria. So what are the criteria for defining life? Well, among other things, living things have DNA, they reproduce, they metabolize food, and they grow and develop. So these are some of the criteria that we use to determine whether or not something is alive. Well, many viruses have DNA. And viruses do reproduce, and yet viruses are not alive. So why not? Well, for one thing, some viruses have RNA instead of DNA. So some viruses don't have DNA. And we saw that's one of our criteria for determining whether or not something's alive. Viruses do not engage in metabolism. They don't eat. They don't use food at all. They don't undergo photosynthesis, and they don't undergo cellular respiration. Also, while viruses do reproduce, they can't reproduce on their own. And we're going to see that viral reproduction is why viruses are so important. The way they reproduce is what brings them into contact with us and the other living things that we depend on. So what are viruses? Well, viruses are particles. And a particle is a tiny piece of matter that's not alive. So we'll use the word particle to refer to viruses. And by the way, the word viral, that's related obviously to the word viruses. So viral and viruses, those are related words. Viruses have two parts. They can have additional parts, but all viruses have at least these two parts. One, they have their DNA or RNA. And two, that DNA or RNA is contained within a capsid. If you look at the image in the top right, the image up here, that red sphere, that's the capsid. There's some structures extending from it, but don't worry about those for now. The red sphere, that's the capsid, and within that, if we were to crack that open, we'd find the DNA or the RNA. And you can see that this other image of a virus, obviously there's a little bit more to this virus, because some viruses have a tail with fibers extending from it. And this is the tail, and these are the fibers. They look like legs. They really aren't legs, but they do function a bit like legs. But we just call them fibers. So a virus has DNA or RNA contained within a capsid. And some viruses have this. This is kind of the classic image of a virus. When I think of a virus, this image pops into my head. This image of a capsid with DNA or RNA in it, and then a tail extending from the capsid with fibers extending from the tail. Viruses are very small. Viruses are even smaller than prokaryotes. On the right, we have a eukaryotic cell. We've noted our bodies are made out of eukaryotic cells. To the left of the eukaryotic cell, we have a prokaryote. Prokaryotes are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. We have 10 times as many bacteria, 10 times as many prokaryotic cells in our bodies as we have human cells. So why don't we look like giant blobs of bacteria if more of the cells in our body are bacterial than human? Well, we don't look like giant blobs of bacteria because our human eukaryotic cells are much larger than those small prokaryotes, those small prokaryotic cells. Well, to the left of the prokaryote, we have the virus, and you can see viruses are much smaller than even prokaryotes. Let's take a look at how viruses reproduce, because this is really what's so important about viruses. Viruses hijack cells. To hijack means to take over, so viruses take over cells. The cell the virus takes over is called a host cell. In this image on the right, these are our viruses, and they're taking over this cell here. This is the DNA in the cell. Obviously, yellow isn't going to work there. So this is the DNA in the cell. This is the cell's membrane here. And this virus up here, it's taking over the cell. We're going to see what it's actually doing is this here is the viral DNA. DNA and RNA contain genetic information. Genetic information contains instructions for building proteins. And cells are constantly building proteins based on their DNA. The virus injects its DNA into the cytoplasm of the host cell. But the host cell cannot tell the difference between its own DNA and the viral DNA. The host cell begins building proteins based on the instructions in the viral DNA. The host cell also replicates the virus's DNA. It replicates or copies the viral DNA. In the image on the right, we have a virus injecting its DNA into a host cell up on the top. And then below that, we have the host cell filling up with the proteins and the DNA or RNA of the virus that it's building based on the instructions in the viral DNA. The proteins the host cell is producing will be assembled into new viruses. The host cell is making copies of the virus. In other words, the virus has tricked the host cell into reproducing the virus. We said that viruses reproduce, and then we said viruses can't reproduce on their own. Well, this is what we mean. They can't reproduce on their own, so what they do is they trick cells into reproducing the virus. This process does not end well for the host cell. Eventually, the cell is overwhelmed, and the cell dies, and countless new viruses burst forth from the cell. And you can see that happening on the right. When viruses take over a cell, we say that it has infected the cell. And if the host cell is part of a multicellular organism, such as a human being, these new viruses will infect new host cells in that organism. In the image on the bottom right, we see the viruses emerging from a host cell that has been overwhelmed. Imagine that was happening in your body. Those new viruses are going to then go on, they're going to spread throughout your body and infect new host cells. Well, when we get sick, like this poor little boy in the image, it's often because a virus has infected our body. But in most cases, our immune system can eventually stop the infection, which is why when you get a cold, you eventually get over it. This process of viruses destroying cells in your body, it doesn't continue indefinitely. We have immune systems which defend us. They just take a little bit of time to get up and going, which is why the cold doesn't go away right away, but after a few days it usually does. These are images of real viruses infecting cells. Now, they're taken with electron microscopes. And whenever you produce an image with an electron microscope, it's always black and white. So the color here has been added. The color helps us identify the different structures in the image, so it's helpful. It does have kind of the funny effect of making the images almost beautiful, which is a little funny only because these are images of viruses destroying living cells. In the image on the left, the brown represents a host cell. It's from a monkey. And the red is a virus called the Ebola virus emerging from that cell. So that cell has died, and the red represents the virus emerging from the cell. In the image on the right, the blue is the cell, and the yellow is the virus. But this isn't just any old virus. This is human immunodeficiency virus. This is HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. And so this is a human cell being destroyed by HIV. You might be thinking, why doesn't the immune system that we just mentioned before, why doesn't the immune system kick in and repel this virus? Well, the reason is this. Human immunodeficiency virus destroys T cells. T cells are your immune system. So what's so devastating about HIV is that it actually destroys your body's defenses. So when you die from AIDS, what you actually die from is other infections because HIV destroyed your immune system and left you vulnerable to sicknesses that would never normally kill a person. We're going to look at a lot of MCAS questions, but we'll go pretty quickly. Which of the following diagrams represents a virus? The answer obviously is C. I'll just note that it called the capsid a capsule, right? So it might be called a capsule on the MCAS, but it's also called a capsid Yellow fever, encephalitis, and measles are diseases in humans. The disease-causing agents take over the machinery of the cells and use it to reproduce. Well, there's our answer right there. We already know this is a virus based on that. Based on this information, the agents that cause these diseases are which of the following? A, fungi, B, ticks, C, viruses, or D, worms? And the answer is C. Viruses take over the machinery of cells and use it to reproduce. Blue tongue virus causes severe disease in sheep and cattle. High levels of infection in livestock populations can threaten the livestock industry. Livestock, that just means farm animals. The sheep and the cattle, that's the livestock they're talking about. Which of the following statements best describes how a blue tongue virus particle reproduces in its sheep or cattle host? A, the virus immediately kills the animal and then escapes to reproduce. B, the virus makes spores that are shed on the ground with the animal's waste. C, the virus uses the animal's cellular machinery to reproduce inside the animal. Or D, the virus releases eggs into the, it's not that one. Obviously, the answer is C. Viruses take over cells and they use those cells to reproduce. Which of the following statements describes a difference between how viruses reproduce and how cells reproduce? A, viruses can reproduce sexually or asexually, whereas cells only reproduce sexually. B, viruses reproduce by DNA translation, whereas cells reproduce by DNA transcription. C, viruses need carbon dioxide to reproduce, but cells need oxygen to reproduce. These are all terrible answers, so it must be D. D, viruses need to enter a living cell to reproduce, but cells reproduce on their own. And it's that. Remember we said viruses can't reproduce on their own. They take over host cells to reproduce. Which of the following always requires the cellular machinery of a host cell in order to reproduce? This is a big word on the MCAS when we're talking about viruses. Obviously, the answer is C. Viruses need host cells to reproduce. A flu virus can remain infectious on surfaces such as desks and doorknobs for long periods of time. How does the ability of the flu virus to remain infectious on surfaces lead to high rates of flu illness? A, the virus has time to grow to a very large size. B, the virus can go through many reproductive cycles. C, the virus has many chances to enter a host cell in which it will reproduce. Or D, the virus can exchange genetic material with other disease-causing agents. The answer is C. Which of the following statements best compares reproduction in viruses with reproduction in single-celled protists? I'm not going to read all the answers in this one because I think you're picking up on the pattern here. The answer is C. Viruses require the cellular machinery of host cells to reproduce. This question is going to teach us not to get too casual about using our clues because the word host cell is over here, but B is not the answer. So let's read the question. Which of the following statements best describes the reproduction of both viruses and cells? Well, viruses need host cells, but ordinary cells do not. So that's why B is not the answer. So read the other ones. A, viruses and cells use mitosis to reproduce. C, viruses and cells must activate polar bodies to reproduce. Or D, viruses and cells need copies of their genetic material to reproduce. The answer is D. Remember, cells have DNA, and viruses have DNA or RNA, and the RNA can also be its genetic material. This video was about viruses. We saw that viruses are particles. They're not alive. Viruses do have DNA or RNA, and that DNA or RNA is contained within a capsid. But viruses need host cells to reproduce. They can't reproduce on their own. And our bodies have an immune system to help fight off viruses that usually succeeds in eventually repelling viral infections.